and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. A couple of weeks ago, Marlene and I were guests of the Edinburgh Yes Hub at an event they put on called Scotland, Democracy and the Future. Now, this was a panel with Euan Hyslop, SNP Councillor, Colin Fox, SSP, Alex Martin, standing as an independent, and Kenny MacAskill from Alba. They were discussing the UK's democratic system, whether it's working for Scotland and its future. The chair was Peace Campaigner Janet Fenton, and she took questions from the audience in batches of 5 or 6. But first, each of the panellists was given 5 minutes to address the audience, and that's where we'll pick it up.
So I suppose I should say from the offset that I'm here instead of Samita, who is the MP or the candidate for the SNP here in the general election for Edinburgh South, who's my council colleague and has just recently become SNP council group leader, which is a massive achievement for the first. I think it's our first female, but also first BAME council group leader. Looking across the panel, obviously, you know, there's 4 white men, and I know that Samita's really disappointed that she wasn't able to make it here today. So, I know that the group that have organised the hub made an effort to try and get a representative panel, but unfortunately, with Samita not able to make it, it's turned out the way that it is. I mean, what a fortnight, 2 weeks of politics that have been absolutely tumultuous, and I'm sure that there's going to be lots to talk about, that everybody has lots of questions about I suppose from my own party's perspective, what the last 2 weeks means for democracy in Scotland in the future. But if you'll allow me, I'm going to talk not so much about that, and if that comes up in questions towards the end, I'm really excited to talk more about what that means for Scotland's democracy. But rather, I'll go about answering or asking myself 2 questions and answering them quickly within the 5 minutes allotted. So, second, I'll ask, how will independence improve democracy? And the first question I'm going to ask is Scotland's voice heard? Well, we remain part of the UK. No, is a quick answer to that, isn't it? I think you'd be surprised if I turned around and said yes, the Westminster Parliament does a good job at representing the views of Scotland, and sure get chased out on the streets of South Edinburgh quite rightly as well. So it's often said, but the Scottish people haven't voted for the Tories since 1955, and in my whole adult life, show my age here a wee bit, the government in Westminster has been a Conservative or a coalition government, and the damage that that's caused, for me personally, from my own perspective, the damage that has caused to society, to our economy, 15 years of austerity, failed austerity, is to be seen in the current financial crisis and cost of living crisis that we're seeing today. And it's not the first time that we've had crises in the last 15 years caused by this failed Tory government. So the quicker they're out the door and we see the back of them, the better. That said, it looks like we're about to walk into a Labour government down in Westminster with a lot of power, because it looks, judged by the polls, that they're going to have a significant majority, and that has, I suppose, within the UK government's parliamentary context, the way that the UK Parliament works, which is the sovereignty of Parliament being the utmost importance, the absolute sovereignty of Westminster, with a massive majority, comes with it massive risks for, I would say, for the Scottish democracy, for the voices of the Scottish people, and for questions around whether or how Scottish people can be heard within that. It is a point that's worth making, I think, and before it's a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to, if you will, indulge me. The UK parliamentary system, if with governments, for example, Tony Blair's government that has had quite a sizable majority, they have unchecked power and influence. Tony Blair was able to pass 99.9% of his legislative programme because of the power and influence that you have, because there's no checks and balances within the UK government parliamentary system, because the second chamber, to our shame, and to the shame of the United Kingdom, is an ineffectual, unelected second chamber, which has no mandate from the people. And so there are significant risks that brings, particularly within the current context of post-Brexit, and leaving aside the Brexit vote and how Scottish votes were ignored throughout that process. Ultimately, we got a Brexit that we didn't vote for. The legislative process throughout that period has proven that the Sewell Convention, which is obviously, as you know, the convention that is any legislation that's brought forward by the UK government that impedes upon or infringes upon Scottish or devolved government competency will be, they'll ask for consent first. That was proven throughout the Brexit process and the legislation for the EU withdrawal bill to be not worth the paper that it's written on and absolutely meaningless. So we combine that, with the idea that we're about to welcome a UK government, a Labour government, with significant power within an international context, more than any, for example, US government would ever have. If you take, just as a comparison, I'm going back onto this tangent again, but the Carter government was the last of the US government that had power both within the executive and the legislative, and they were only able to pass 73% of their legislative programme, largely because of the issues that they have with coming together as a party, the separation of powers, the way that the Democratic Party is formulated. But in the UK, we're going to have a Labour government who so far stood on a continuity, pro-austerity platform that are going to come forward with significant amounts of power and influence. 1 minute left. I'm maybe too many tangents, so I'll try and keep to the point. But it's concerning, I think, if you take that into consideration, not only the raw power that a party like the Labour Party with a significant majority in Westminster has, with hand in hand with the idea that the UK Parliament has already intimated that they're willing to impede upon areas of devolved government. It's a really concerning time for Scottish democracy. And I'm going to end with this one quote from the Scottish Government's document, which states, and this is one of the papers on independence around the future of self-government. So the future of Scottish self-government within the UK is therefore clear. Erosion of the autonomy of the Scottish Parliament through constraints in the UK legislation imposed without consent and in breach of the Sewell Convention, and policies increasingly imposed by the UK government for Scotland in devolved areas, whatever the views of the Scottish Parliament, of the people and of the people who live here. So it's a really concerning time for us as we move into this this new period of devolution in Scotland, as we've seen with the Internal Markets Act and the Brexit Freedoms Act and other legislative processes since Brexit, that we have a UK government that's willing to impede upon the sovereignty of the Scottish people, and to, I suppose, directly challenge the views of the Scottish Parliament as elected by the sovereign Scottish people in areas that are devolved issues. So it's a concerning time, and we have to have a conversation as an independence movement about how we challenge that and how we bring that to light.
I'd like to turn next to our other young and new to the scene speaker for tonight, This is Alex Martin. He's hoping to stand as an independent, and he's fairly new to politics.
I won't take too much of your time because I'm a big believer in the wisdom of the group. So I would love to hear from you as well. Your questions, and let's have a dialogue. But I'll just say a few things. What I was thinking when the man who was speaking, the word that keeps coming to mind for me is unity. This is why I'm running as an independent candidate in Edinburgh South. I'm trying to bring people together. And I've sat here actually and had a conversation, and I've really been taking the approach that, look, I want open and honest dialogue. So I think that's the most important thing here. In terms of unity with the Scottish independence movement, one thing that I saw when I went to the rally a few weeks ago in Glasgow was the Green Party actually refused to share the stage with Alba. Now I'm just trying to take an objective view on this, but I would say if independence is our goal, I think maybe do we need to look past some of these other issues and create that unity so that we kind of come together on a shared goal, But I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well. I think it's pretty clear, obviously, everyone in here agree that there's a severe democratic deficit in the UK right now. I'll be honest with you, with Scottish independence, part of me kind of feels bad that we might just be leaving the English to the dogs, so to speak. Because there's democratic deficits everywhere in the UK. It's we can all see that. So I think I'm always trying to create a kind of feeling of we're all in this together. We're sharing this fight together. But I think in terms of independence, it's inevitable due to demographics and simply the direction of the UK government now. We can all see the Labour Party is pretty much no different to the Tories on fundamental issues now, privatisation of the NHS, going back on environmental pledges, things like that. I think what that means is because typically younger people tend to support independence, obviously not all young people, but I think at a certain point it's going to become inevitable. But with Swinney now coming into the SNP, I think as of today it's likely Swinney's going to be the leader. I think his gradualist approach, it's not going to work. I think we've got to have a bit of a stronger approach. And by the way, I'm taking a neutral view on independence partly because Edinburgh South has a range of different views on independence. What I stand for myself is democracy. I stand for people's right to choose and the right to self-determination. So again, I don't want to alienate anyone if you're pro against independence, but I think if we want to do it, the gradualist approach, it's not going to work. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Kenny, do you want to?
Sure, follow on there. I wish independence was inevitable. I always remember an old sheriff saying to me the only two things certain in life are death and taxes. Independence should be coming. Given how close we came in 2014, we screwed the top off the bottle, but we have failed to actually lift that off. So I wish it was inevitable, but I'm not necessarily convinced. We actually have to make sure that it does come about. And the reason that I think it's essential is that we always knew there was going to be a price to be paid for losing the referendum. I don't think we ever anticipated it would be as severe and as high, because, by goodness, the level and extent of what's being imposed upon us is appalling. So we need independence because we need to be able to sort out our society and economy, which are suffering badly, but we also need it for peace, given what Janet was saying. I lived, as did many, through the early 80s when we recall cruise missiles, when it was the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, when we look back and realise how close it came to missiles being launched, albeit by mistake. But I have never been as frightened about war coming as I am now. Down in Westminster, they now openly talk about pre-war planning. It is a phrase I had never heard, pre-war planning. And believe you me, it's not restricted to one side of the chamber. It goes around the chamber, and even the SNP are jumping up and down about Ukraine. I condemn the Russian invasion, but equally, I side with Pope Francis. I want peace in Gaza and I want peace in Europe. And yet what we've got is NATO troops now on the ground in Ukraine. And if you listen to what's happening in the chamber, they want war with Russia. They want war with Iran. And you speak to your Lee and Duncan Smiths and they just throw, well, let's just throw China in as well. We are coming close to World War III and we need to be an independent nation. The same as Ireland is to be able to say, this is not in our name, to have a president that can speak out against what's happening in Palestine, rather than have a British government that's complicit with what Israel is doing. But we also need it for our society and economy, because I'm a child of the 60s. I never saw in West Lothian the poverty that now exists in Scotland. It didn't exist. And it doesn't just exist in the areas that we expected and always had hardship in East End, Glasgow and other places. I was at the food bank in Haddington. Haddington was a nice country town like Linlithgow where I grew up, and yet they require a food bank and it is big and busy. It's not just the trinite and the pans that require it, but we are just simply a resource. My old friend Willie says to me, why do they keep us? Surely they'll just want to get shot at us. And I sent him an article from the Independent written by George Osborne, the British establishment. And it's worth reading. Osborne actually lays down how they, by they, it's the British establishment, Labour as well as Tory. What do they see with Scotland? Well, the position is Northern Ireland, they actually want shot at it. It's outrageous. You know, United Ireland, they won't say it, but they rub their hands in glee, and it's the DUP who are daft enough to sign out for it. Wales, who cares? Scotland, you see what Osborne says, that's ours. That's ours. It's almost Putin speaking about Ukraine. Shared history, it's ours. It's worth having a look at that article. Why do they want us? Because we're a resource. They're here to enjoy. They like to send their kids to Edinburgh. If they can't get to Oxford or Cambridge, well, Edinburgh St Andrews is a good place to go. They're not going to send them to Abertay or Glasgow Cali, but you know, they like here, they like to come to the festival, they like to go to the Highlands. Fundamentally, we're an economic resource. They are taking our oil and gas, burning up the planet, and I believe we have to, you know, keep taking out oil because we require it to make that transition. But they want the oil and gas, and equally they want the renewables that are now there. 124 billion kilowatts of renewable energy is to be cabled and sent south. I had to look up what a terawatt was and worked out. Eventually it's 124 billion kilowatts to go south. Now, I would actually welcome that. That should be something that we should get money for. Are we getting any money? Zero, other than a few pennies to the Crown Estates for cabling across the foreshore. Are we getting any jobs? Well, East Lothian is almost a microcosm of Scotland. There are no jobs there. If you go out to Dunbar, where I now stay, you can see now 36, 40 turbines for the first of the wind farms in the north, in the Firth of Forth. Are they building any in Bifab? No. Methil and Burnt Island are just lying empty. They're bringing them in from the Netherlands, from Indonesia, from other places. So we're a resource. We've just become a glorified transition station. You know, they're actually going to build pylons from the north, east of Scotland, down the east coast, through the central belt, to supply Merseyside, exactly the same as they're cabling down the east coast to get it into the east coast of England, and down the west coast to get into the west coast of England. We're getting no money, no jobs, and in an energy-rich country, we're touching 50% fuel poverty in parts. Pensioners are at 36% fuel poverty, with a quarter in extreme fuel poverty. If anything makes a case for independence, it's that we're an energy-rich country and our people are fuel poor, which is absurd. So that's why we need independence. We need it for peace, to get out of the Dr. Strangelove position, because if anybody thinks David Lammy is going to be a voice of sanity, he ain't no Robin Cook. I knew Robin Cook. I stood against Robin Cook. I disagreed with him on the Constitution, but he was a good and brave man and he spoke out against Iraq. That ain't going to come from that Labour front bench. They'll be as complicit and as much a war party as Biden Democrats are. So we need it for peace, we need it for our society to stop this appalling levels of poverty, children born with no future and no opportunity of employment. And I'll end slowly on the Grangemouth campaign, because that is deindustrialisation. We're 40 years on from the pits. This is about closing down us as an industrial country. Do you know, if that closes, we will be the only major oil producing nation that doesn't have a refinery capacity. Now, I did have somebody who actually loads me in North Berwick right to say we didn't talk about the environmental aspects. And I had to write back to them to say, one, Grangemouth isn't, environmentally disastrous. It's as good as you could get for a plant. Sending it elsewhere wouldn't necessarily be better. But let me assure you, sir, we've already got 600 ship movements going up and down the River Forth at the present moment. Once it just becomes a storage plant and you're taking North Sea oil out to have it refined and then you're bringing it back in to use it, it won't be 600 ships, it will be way beyond that. And they'll be bringing them into the Clyde at Finner. So we are just becoming a resource to be exploited. We lose the skilled labour. We already have a skilled labour shortage. Grangemouth students can become almost just a storage plant or a car park. We cannot allow that to happen. That is the major industrial dispute of our time, and we've got to rally behind that. And I have to say, the Scottish Government has got to step up to the plate. The idea that it's going to become sustainable aviation fuel, or indeed, these fuels will come, but they're not coming in the next few years. And by the time these things do become commercial, it will be a Tesco or a car park. So that's why we need independence.
I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that you share an interest in politics. Maybe it's been fashioned by the events of the last week or so. I also wanted to say this, watching Janet chair the meeting, convene the meeting, I look at Janet and Euan and Alex, my new friends. I look at Janet's hair, I look at Kenny's hair, I look at my hair, and there's grey in there, as you've probably spotted. I wanted to take this opportunity to put on record the work that Janet Fenton and Kenny MacAskill are doing today is the most important they've ever done in their lives. I've known them for a long time. The work Kenny MacAskill's doing as the MP for East Lothian, I've known Kenny since way back in the anti-poll tax days, so that wasn't yesterday. I've known the work that Janet's done for a long time. I went to the recent CND conference, and there's a great deal of wisdom there, and there's a great deal to be said about the work you do today, being in the same quality, laying down, standing on the principles you stood right through. And if you may indulge me, it reminds me of a quote that was attributed, of all people, to Leon Trotsky in the late 1930s, who led the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and he claimed that the finest work he left mankind was in the late 1930s towards the end of his life. And I think that's quite something to say. I wanted to put that on the record in front of Janet and Ken here, whom I greatly regard, and I look forward to Alex and Euan's contribution tonight as well. Janet posed the question, what could the future mean? I'm a socialist. I hope the future means that we're going to see an independent socialist Scotland that's a modern democratic republic. I'm already sick to the back teeth of King Charles. I've kept calling Prince Charles for a long time now, I've got to call him the king. I want a republic. I want to see a modern democratic republic where we, the people, elect our head of state, where there are no such thing as the divine right of kings and hereditary privileges. You've got to show how good you are to us constantly for us to earn our trust and apply to be leader of this country or any country. And actually, those ideas are probably 500 years old at least. So maybe when people say, socialist ideas belong to the past, well, I'm having that idea, because I happen to think that's an idea whose time it came, and we're still waiting in Britain. America's not got a king, Germany's not got a king, France hasn't got a king, China hasn't got a king. Look around the world, India's not got a king or a queen, have they? We're left behind. In many ways, that speaks to the failure of the union that Scotland joined 300 years ago, didn't it? Where the merchant classes in Scotland sold the jerseys like they're commonly used to doing, and the English ruling class had to step in and bail them out because of the Darien disaster. Well, that's played its part, that's played its course 300 years ago. It's way, way out of date. The empire is over. As Kenny mentions there about the Westminster Parliament is utterly out of touch with public opinion in this country on Gaza, for example. Where 90% of the population want a ceasefire, we want it now because we're sick to the back teeth of the killing, and we want the talking to begin. There is no military solution to the war in Gaza, to the dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We've learned that, if we've learned nothing in 80 years, have we? And yet we're constantly told Israel has the right to defend itself. Well, it does. But it doesn't have the right to kill 35,000 Palestinians in cold blood. Nobody has that right. They don't have that right. But according to the Westminster Parliament, Kenny and others who raised that point of view were not heard, shouted down. That's an outrage. And I have to say, one of my great heroes, Janet, was Tony Benn, who taught us as young socialists, never get on the wrong side of democracy. When you're on the wrong side of the democratic will of the people, you're on a hiding, which Margaret Thatcher found to her cost in the late 1980s, didn't she? When she was on the wrong side of the anti-poll tax struggle. We're on the right side of history. People want their independence in Scotland. We've got our job in front of us at this meeting and others to persuade the majority that it's perfectly normal, it's perfectly right, it's perfectly democratic, and that when we have marshalled a majority of people who want independence, we will have it, and nobody will stop us. No forces in the world are capable of stopping the will of the people if they decide that they want independence. Of course, the challenge facing us just now is there isn't a majority, and we have to face facts. And I look at the political situation we're in, and I look, we're apparently 3 or 4 months away from a Westminster general election, where all the polls suggest that Labour is going to romp it. We're looking at a Labour majority of 3 figures. Back to the result that 1997, Tony Blair's majority was 168. I'm not sure if it'll be that big, but I think it'll be 3 figures. I think Keir Starmer will have a 100-seat majority. And I look at the polls in Scotland, and they apparently tell us that a chunk of supporters of independence are voting Labour. Why? Why are Yes supporters in Scotland voting Labour when they know, they do know, everybody knows it, Labour's a unionist party. Labour will die in a ditch like George Osborne for the union. Make no mistake about it. The question arises, so how, as supporters of independence, can we reconcile the fact that there's 10 or 15% of the Yes support voting for Labour? And to me the answer is simple. The key issue in this general election is we've got to get rid of the Tories. That's it. It's not complicated. We've got to get rid of the Tories. They're hated. They've been in power since 2010. When you think of Cameron, followed by Johnson, followed by Truss, followed by Sunak, one diddy after another that are now absolutely despised. The Tories are for a doing, and good riddance to bad rubbish. They're going to be replaced by a Labour government that I expect, it'll get a honeymoon period. It will be difficult for the independent supporters in the beginning to watch Starmer in the first year he has. But I've been through, as Janet and Kenny and comrades here, been through Labour governments before, and they fail badly. Ramsay MacDonald, waster. Clement Attlee, Major Clement Attlee, launched imperial campaigns around the world. You know, he was fired out 5 years later, what, 150-seat majority. 4 years later, it was gone. Because he didn't deliver for working people. Harold Wilson, waster. James Callaghan, Tony Blair, enough said to this audience. Labour will fail working people. Keir Starmer has no intentions whatsoever of doing anything about the poverty in Edinburgh and West Lothian and none whatsoever. I bring you that news. He'll not say that himself. But they won't. Labour are warmongers in Gaza, warmongers in Ukraine. NATO was established by a Labour government. The biggest advocates of NATO in 1948 were Labour. This is a party of warmongers. Tony Blair, I mention his name again. I have absolutely no expectations in a Labour government. I'll go further. I do have the expectation that Labour government will fail within a year. What's the name of her name? What's her name? Shadow Chancellor. Rachel Reeves. She's so famous I forget her every time I mention her. Our politics are exactly the same as the Tories. And here's the great irony that I maybe leave you with this. Keir Starmer's strategy is perfectly clear. Keir Starmer believes that the Tory brand is toxic, but the Tory policies aren't they? Keir Starmer's Health Secretary, West Keating, intends to privatise the NHS. By the way, we're only a few hundred yards away from 2 privatised hospitals. The Edinburgh Royal Infirmary privatised under a PFI by New Labour, and the Sick Kids Hospital privatised by the SNP government, sitting right next to it. I'm a socialist. I'm damned if you're going to privatise the NHS and I'm going to speak out about it. It's not right. It's not what the people of this country want. But what Streeting's offering us, more privatisation, not just the NHS, more privatisation of the schools, etc. Again, wrong side of history, wrong side of democracy. So I don't have any expectations in Labour achieving anything. I have expectations in Labour actually continuing with the same policies that we have. Never mind continuity politicians, continuity First Ministers. You get continuity capitalism, rapacious, greedy, ruthless, exploitative. That's what I expect of a Labour government. Within a year, I put it on the record in front of you. Labour's 20% ahead in the polls just now, aren't they? Within a year of Labour getting elected, my expectation is they'll be 20% behind, because their policy on every major regard has got failure written over it. Ask yourself what Labour intend to do about the social care crisis in Britain, where elderly people, denied the treatment they should get in their retirement, looked after working for the country for 40 or 50 years, are put in jumped up bed and breakfast. They don't have the possible health care that they should, the support they got. And remember the figures that died during COVID? They were an outrage, the amount of people. And in Edinburgh South, where I represented the council, stood for the council a few months ago, the highest death rate of any single ward in Scotland was in that one, because there are 5 privately owned care homes in that ward in Liverton and Gilman, and Labour won't do anything about that. So my attitude to the independence movement is, this will be difficult in the short term. And then once that Labour government fails, as it certainly will in my view, what roars back into the top of the political agenda in Scotland is what's called the national question. Because we in Scotland have got an option that the rest of Britain don't, which we can take our decisions for ourselves and establish an independent Scotland. And I'm positive about that. I'm positive about that's going to be the case. The failed Labour government will be the biggest recruiting sergeant independence has got, in the same way that Thatcher was the biggest recruiting sergeant for New Labour, and Tony Blair was one of the biggest recruiting sergeants for the Scottish Socialist Party. They didn't mean it, but that was the effect, and that's what I expect in the years to come.
Whether or not you would support the pledge on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, that's a very simple question. And should we be trying to incorporate the changes we want to see as we go, and how do we deal with that, or is it a question of waiting until it happens? So we've also got what the panel's views are on currency and banks, and we've got a question about dealing with poverty and how we manage collective debt, new country, old problems. How do we address them and do things differently? Because an independent Scotland would still be subject to all the corporate pressures and malign forces that every country is facing. You can take all of them, or you can take one of them.
I'll not take all of them. I'll take the ones I like the best.
Yeah, fair enough.
The easiest to answer. This is a question that comes up a lot, especially for socialists. How are you going to pay for this? How are you going to pay for that? How are you going to pay for the next time? As you know, I do Wednesday, Thursday and Friday a stall for the Scottish Socialist Party, Wellington's Horse. And right round the corner on Leith Street, there's a company called Bailey Gifford, asset managers. The second biggest shareholders in Tesla cars after Elon Musk. It's worth reflecting the amount of money that's actually in this city, isn't it? Edinburgh is the 5th biggest financial centre in Europe, after London, Paris, Milan, Frankfurt, it's Edinburgh. So in answer to the question about debt, I was always raised, I'm a good working class laddie, raised by my grandparents and mother will to pay my way. Debt to my grandparents was a shame. The last thing they wanted if they died, for God's sake don't leave me in debt, it'd be a shame in the name of the Fox family or the Mackin family forevermore. I believe in those values, I believe in paying your way, I believe that debt should be paid off. This is the antithesis of modern capitalism. America's debt runs into trillions. It's probably beyond the counting of Einstein himself. It's gone way into the stratosphere. They didn't pay their way, they just kept borrowing and borrowing. Britain's done the same, borrowing. Germany, borrowing. China, borrowing. And of course what happens is, it comes to haunt you in the end. You've got to pay it back. We had, how many financial crashes have we had in our life? 2008, etc. So the issue for me is, the money is here. You don't need to borrow. The money is here in Edinburgh. We need to go to Bailey Gifford and say, You know, that money you've got, we're going to build council houses in Edinburgh with that money you've got, because the housing situation in this city is an absolute outrage that people 100 years ago would be horrified at, who lived in the grass market and came out to live in the inch. There are social problems that need to be addressed, not by borrowing, but by redistribution of wealth. And that term, actually I heard John Swinney saying this today. He gets a name as a bank manager, John Swinney, didn't he? There's a great deal of talk about redistribution of wealth and how poverty is horrifying. What is lacking is any action to do about it. It's a trope. Who stands for election? Oh, poverty and inequality. Well, when are you going to do anything about it? When are you going to do anything about it? That's the key question, isn't it? And they don't do anything. Because behind them stand international capital who say, no, we're not going to let you build council houses in Edinburgh. You're not going to have social housing. We're building at the outskirts of Edinburgh, just up the road for the inch, in the bypass, all the empty farm fields, £500,000 houses. My kids are not going to be buying a £500,000 house, not when they work with the NHS at 20,000. Even if they lie, and Halifax helps them about lying about the mortgage multiplier, still not going to get a £500,000 house. So the question here is, the debt question and the issue of our public services and the absolute crisis they're in. My mum worked for the NHS for 42 years at Law Hospital in Carluke, and the NHS has never been as bad as this, not since it started. It just hasn't. You know, the waiting times, the shortages, the morale of the staff, my aunties and uncles are nurses, and they're absolutely demoralised because there's a shortage of staff. There's a rip-off. That Royal Infirmary, we're going to have to pay 3 times what it cost us to build it under the NHS to the private company who owns it. These have got to be questions that are addressed, and they've got to be addressed meaningfully. And the second thing is going to answer is simply Edward's question about democracy. Because the question is, democracy is precious, you've got to look after it. The independence referendum had an 80% turnout. I stood in Liberton and Gilman. Euan stood for the council. Local government turnout, 20%. What are people telling you? I don't give a shite. I'm not going to vote. What does it do? Wasters. People participate when they've got a point and they've got a reason and they're driven to do something. Participation tells you a great deal. I believe in democracy. But you've got to work at it. You've got to make sure it's meaningful. You've got to make sure that the choices are in between, as they said famously in Trainspotting, death by fire, death by drowning, death by poisoning. That's what the 3 main parties offer you. I'm sorry to say. No real change. Starmer's a Tory. Labour are blue Tories. And unless the SNP changes its way, and I have to say I'm not optimistic, that's probably why I'm not in the SNP, I don't think John Swinney's going to achieve much either. Best of luck to him. I thought some things he said today were valuable, especially when he said you can learn a lot from people you don't agree with. He's quite right. I think that was a olive branch to Kate Forbes. That was wise. He's learned a lot in his 40 years actively. I believe in that as a socialist. That's a socialist idea. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You start with an idea, you hear somebody with the opposite or a different idea, and you learn from them and they learn from you. That's how we go on. I offer you that, I learned that, I offer you to do what you like with it. That's the answer as far as I'm concerned. And the thing about unity, I think David was saying about leashed until Indy. I'm afraid the Scottish Socialist Party's been on the receiving end of that for 10 years. Colin, don't talk about a republic. Colin, don't talk about socialism. Colin, don't talk about this. Don't talk about fuel poverty, etc. That'll have to wait till we get to independence. I'm afraid that's a cul-de-sac. It's a dead end. There's one thing more important than unity, and that's clarity. You have to know what you stand for. Otherwise, it's the unity of the graveyard. So clarity is more important than unity. And we've a great deal of work to do in the independence movement about clarifying where we stand and how we're going to get to the promised land. And I'm happy to share that journey on the way.
I heartily endorse a lot of what Colin's saying. I fully agree with him. You know, Wish for Indy was always nonsense, and it's even more so. We're dealing with the questions to some extent in reverse order. Of course, we should be endorsing TPNW. I mean, as I was saying at the outset, this situation critical is now approaching. If there is conflict in Ukraine that widens to include NATO, we are looking at battlefield nuclear weapons being used. If you read, the analysis of how the military strategists are going, then you're talking about Russia probably, if it's forced back because NATO enters in because Ukraine is getting beat, then you are looking at battlefield nuclear weapons being used. It is horrific, and therefore, whether they're of a lesser scale than the cruise missiles that was going to take out everybody, that's the situation. I was actually having a wee chat with George Galloway because we mentioned during defence questions, I think him and Jeremy Corbyn couldn't get in, so I had to go in. 102 years ago, the British Army had 100,000 soldiers in Ireland. Now, you don't even have 10,000 soldiers in Scotland. But you have 10,000 US airmen, mostly in England, because there's 10,000 US forces personnel in the UK, just over 10,000. Most of them are in, the east of England for, bombing raids that will contain nuclear warheads. So the situation is extremely critical. In terms of, John Wilkinson's question, absolutely, we have to get our own currency and we have to have our own central bank and we have to get there as quickly as possible. You cannot delay it, it can't be done overnight, but you have to move fast to get there. All the lessons that we've learned, not just from Greece, from Ireland, from all these things, you have to be in control of that. And, that's a lesson that we've had to learn and we need to do on that. In terms of Fiona's presence, one of the few presents I get in Westminster is actually going and having a cup of tea for every so often the Lord Prem Seeker. Everything that Jeremy Corbyn was laughed at about, governments being able to invest, Rishi Sunak did during COVID. This idea there's no magic money tree. You printed money. Corbyn said they would do that to invest in the economy. Sunak did it to keep the economy afloat. So yes, there are issues in terms of what we're spending, but the problem is that there's plenty of money for weapons of war. There's plenty of money to shore up the Ukrainians. There's plenty of money, for tax cuts. There's plenty of money, Prime Secretary tells me, in the City of London, even if some of it's relocating to the Netherlands post-Brexit or whatever else. But, Britain remains enthralled to the City of London. So that's why it comes back. You have to have your own central bank to be able to set interest rates. We also have to be able to address the whole distortion. Because, Margaret Thatcher sacrificed, the UK economy, in terms of, crushing organised labour, but we're now paying the price in terms of, how the UK economy is being sacrificed. And I think in terms of democracy, it has to be bottom up. I heartily endorse what Colin is saying. The tragedy is, it's not just, coming around by accident. It is by design. The Tories want a society where people do not vote. I was actually having a coffee with my brother yesterday, and he said, when do you think the election will be? Well, the Tories tell me they think it'll be 14th of November. And he said, November, why would they want a winter election? Because they don't want people to go to the polls. They're already discouraging you from voting. They're already making it difficult to vote. So actually, the 14th of November, if it's dark and miserable and rain, that suits them. They want turnout to go down, and turnout is going to go down, believe me. Because, I've been chatting doors, you're going to pay my electricity then? No. Well, I'm not voting. Because that's what my problem, mate. None of you are going to sort out my electricity and I can't heat my home. So I'm not bothering you. Only. It's the tragedy, that's what we face. So democracy has to be bottom up. We actually have to get more representative areas. We have to get down community councils. You have to reinvent or keep them, but you have to give them power. People have to have decisions that they feel can be made, not just centralised. The idea that Craig Miller can't decide, what on running its own gala day or whatever without having to go to a motion of the council. All of these have to change. But the final point I would make, because I think it ties in with both John's point and indeed Andrew's point, I did believe, in some ways, not all of our problems would be resolved by independence, but most of our problems, I thought, were caused by the state of the Constitution, other than the economic positions that, Colin and I would concur on. Equally, I have to say, over recent years, I have to say, many of the issues I face, including, what was wrongly done to Craig Murray, you can't blame that on Westminster. You can't blame that on an English Tory government. That rests here. Their failure to sort out a problem with the Crown Office, their failure to separate, the office of Lord Advocate, from the head of the prosecution service to sitting in the government, that is not correct. There are whole things like that you simply cannot blame on the Tories or on Westminster. There is a problem in Scotland. We have to sort it out, and we haven't been sorting it out. And that is why there has to be change, not simply constitutionally, but there has to be change in how we're running our country, because it's not right. It is undemocratic, and Craig's 6 months was appalling and an indictment upon Scottish society.
Okay, I'll take the hard one from the lovely gentleman over here on currency. I used to work in the financial sector in London and Edinburgh, so I can maybe offer some unique insight on that. And I'll just preface what I'm saying by saying I support the right to choose democracy, but I'm neutral on the independence question. I'm really supporting what the people want for that. But I think it's silly to not plan ahead for something that looks increasingly likely in the future. So I'm going to answer this objectively. I think with the currency question, Scotland could be a pioneer in central bank digital currency. You might have heard of Scotcoin. Basically, the prevailing winds in finance at the moment are that every central bank is at some point going to have a CBDC, which basically means everyone in the country would have an account with the central bank. Now, you immediately think, well, that's too much power for the government, right? But the answer to that is the private banks already have that much power. They can close you off whenever they want. So would you rather you have an account in the government, with the government, which has democratic oversight, or in the private bank? This actually comes into your question as well. Why have we got so much debt? How are we going to deal with that? Part of the reason we've got so much debt is because when the government stimulates the economy, they have to go through the private banks. The quantitative easing goes into the private banks, not directly to people. But if you have a CBDC, which Scotland could pioneer if we're independent, the money can go directly into people's accounts to stimulate the economy. It's called helicopter money. So I just thought that might be an interesting solution to that. I do want to ask a question though, as well, if you can add. So I spent 4 years in the British Army Reserves, and I left recently to stand as a candidate. It seems to me like the view in the British Army is that there's not enough resources, we won't be able to defend ourselves properly as an independent nation. I'm just curious if that's true, other members of the panel, if you've looked into that more deeply, is there any validity to that?
Interesting question. But before we get into that, would you like to respond to one?
I would love to respond to a couple. Yeah, so I agree with what's been said about the wish for indie until indie concept being a bit nonsense. I think that I know from my own perspective, obviously as a member of the SNP, and I think that I would share this with people across Scottish society who are absolutely disgusted at what's going on in Gaza. Just as an example, how welcome it's been to have a First Minister that's spoken out on issues of international importance and giving us a voice that's separate from what's been spoken about down south. Just one example of where I think on the international stage we should be doing whatever we can to make our voice heard. And we shouldn't be wheeshed until indie. We should be making as much noise as possible to make it clear that this Conservative government that's been in power for 14 years does not represent us and does not speak for us. And I think that throughout this process, Hamza has done a good job throughout the war in the Gaza. It did a good job in representing that. And obviously, without question, and support the Treaty of Prohibition on nuclear weapons. I think the wish till indie thing comes about a lot of this discussion, I suppose, within the SNP, because the SNP is a broad church about to what extent we should be implementing policy that is not widely popular. And I think the events of the last 2 weeks cause them to question, well, what is the change going to be? Because we have now a minority government who are ultimately going to have to move to a policy, a legislative programme, which is, from a minority government perspective and position, and there are others on the panel that will have more experience in this than me, has to try and garner support from opposition parties. And so the question around what policies are we putting forward, how do we garner popular support from them, I think ties into that question, because there are some social policies, for example, that are really popular within the Greens, that have been part of the programme for government, which have had lots of criticism within the airwaves over the last 2 years, which a lot of our the independence movement are divided on. And so the question around what should we be doing, Wish for Indy, it ties into that idea around where your government prioritises its programme. And I'm hoping that moving forward with the new government, it looks like it's going to, as you've said, be led by John Swinney, focuses on the issues of the day that are really important. The most important issue in the current climate is the cost of living crisis. And so I'm hoping that we can move forward, bridge a gap around some of the kind of, I suppose, issues that have caused a lot of division within the independence movement and within the party over the last 2 years or year, and hopefully move towards a process of reconciliation. I want to touch on the question around improving democracy from Ed. So obviously our Scottish Parliament is already more democratic than the system that we have down south. We have proportional representation. We took steps to make our councils proportionally representative through multi-member wards and a list system or a multi-member ward system, which is also a different form of PR. I want to make a point which I think is quite interesting from my experience of being a councillor for the last 2 years, which I think ties into this. I think that as soon as we get independence, we're going to become it's going to be far more healthy for our democracy. I think actually the dominance of the constitutional question is actually unhealthy for our democracy. And let me give you an example why. In the council that we're currently sitting in, Edinburgh, City of Edinburgh Council, Labour are in coalition with the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, which is an absolute shame. A shame on the Labour Party and the traditions of the Labour Party that they've done that. There's Conservative politicians in the council that are on highly paid jobs because the Labour Party are paying them off for their support in the council. And the reason why they've done that is because who's the leader of the Scottish Labour Party? Sorry. Anna Sarwar. Sorry, exactly, yeah. In 2022, just after the council elections, said that under no circumstances in local government will any of his local council groups form coalitions with the SNP. And this, in Edinburgh, from an Edinburgh perspective, I think there's, taking a bit of context, it was potentially 9 councils across Scotland where the Labour Party are in coalition with the Conservatives, which is absolutely abhorrent. Going back to 2017, the SNP for the first time led a coalition with the Labour Party to run as a coalition the Edinburgh Council. So coming off of that 5-year term, the SNP had led the council in coalition with Labour. Anna Sarwar said, under no circumstances whatsoever are you to form a coalition with the SNP. And so Labour had, obviously they want the high paid jobs, they want to have power, they start to go and have conversations with Conservatives and Liberal Democrats about running the council. The Labour Party, in local policy terms, and the Constitution has no significance within how our schools are run, how our roads and public services are maintained. Local policy has nothing to do with the Constitution. So Anna Sarwar coming out with that proposal and that suggestion in that direction is so damaging to local government. We had a working relationship with Labour. We share a lot of the same ideas and interests in local policy, but that direction of travel caused a lot of damage, I think. And now we have a situation where the Conservative Party, who were roundly rejected at the 2022 local council elections, they went down from 20 local councillors to about, I think, 9. So, okay, a massive rejection. Were handed not only high-paid jobs by the Labour Party, but significant power, more power than they've had in a generation to run services and have influence within our city. Just because Anna Sarwar doesn't like the idea that the SNP are in favour of independence and Labour are a unionist party, and that they can't work together as a result because of the potential that might influence the Scottish Parliament elections or the Westminster elections, because other unionist parties will weaponise Labour in coalition. So the point, to conclude, is on your question is, I think that when we move past and we become independent, 100%, it's going to make our democracy much healthier, because we can actually start working, particularly in a proportional representation system where Scottish Parliament is. Our new independent Scottish Parliament will be on a party basis where we're actually cooperating with parties based on our shared interests, not based on what our view is on the constitutional question.
I'm just wondering, before you finish, and I'll give the other panellists the same opportunity, do you have any comments on the question that Alex has put about army reserves and resources?
I think there's a debate to be had around what a Scottish defence force looks like. You know, I mean, as soon as we scrap our nuclear weapons, we're going to have a lot of money to play with, and I believe that we can move to an Irish model where we have a lot more territorial defence around the coasts, have more investment in, you know, submarines and a naval force that defends our coast. I remember an anecdote. This is old now, predates obviously the war in Ukraine and the illegal invasion from Russia and Ukraine, but where a Russian sub entered Scottish waters. I think this was probably the Independence Day, and they had the UK border force and naval force had to send a submarine, the only one that was available, from Portsmouth all the way up into the North Sea in order to confront this submarine. I think that if Scotland had the powers and had its own naval force, it would do a much better job of protecting Scottish waters and investing in Scottish defence that actually makes sense in the 21st century than having these redundant submarines with nuclear weapons that are absolutely abhorrent on our coasts that we should completely get rid of. That's my view on it, but I'm sure that others will come.
Thank you. Colin, do you want to comment on that particular question from your fellow panellists?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Euan. It's an interesting question, very interesting, and I would like to bring you a socialist perspective on defence spending. Two questions: who are we defending ourselves from? Where is this money going to be spent? What, are we going to take war to the Russians? Are we going to fight the Norwegians? Are we going to fight the Irish? What is the point of it? Who are we defending? Where is your defence necessary? And I suppose as a socialist, I'm often presented, well, the socialists are all naive, they're in favour of peace, brotherhood and love and understanding, like John Lennon as opposed to Vladimir. But it's a legitimate question. Who are you defending yourself from? From what purpose? And the flip side of the coin, I have to offer a meeting like this. One of my great, I don't want to go so far as a hero, but Hamish Henderson was a native of this city. He lived not too far from here. He wrote a wonderful poem that, it's only my point of view, but I would long advocate it as the national anthem of Scotland. It's called Freedom Come All Ye, and there's a verse in it where it refers, and unfortunately we as a country have inherited things that we're ashamed of, and we should be ashamed of. There's a verse in there that talks about black kids and kids from other parts of the world for whom the skill of the bagpipes and the sight of the tartan evokes fear, oppression, misery. I think of Iraqi kids seeing black watch tanks in their streets. I think of the role that the British Empire played in using Scottish soldiers in many of its wars. I'm sorry to say there are certain parts of Scottish history that I'm ashamed of. And I think that's a broad sense of people who are brought and acquainted with it. And those are facts that, as Burns said, shields are things that dinna ding. You can't avoid them. And therefore I would be very, very wary indeed of a defence policy that had the smearest hint of warmongering. I'm alright about defending myself. I'm not a pacifist. I'll defend myself. I defend my point of view. Defence is defence. But often in the lexicon of this is a euphemism for attack. It's not defence, it's Orwellian. Defence spending means attacking somebody else. gunships, warships, F-16s, etc. That's not the defence policy I want for an independent Scotland. I want it to be at peace with the world. I want a defence force that will go around the world and say we apologise for the role historically that Scotland was forced to play before it was independent, but there's a new world order, and that new world order we're going to defend, Peace. And if I can say this, Janet, this is now the commercial break, because I've just written a book on the war in Ukraine. It's called War and Peace in Ukraine. I stole part of the title from Tolstoy. There it's there. War and Peace in Ukraine.
You can buy it here.
You can buy it here for £6. See me at the end. But the point is, it makes the case for peace. I want peace between the Ukrainians and the Russians. I want an end to the slaughter. They reckon there's 400,000 people being killed already in the 2 years. And it's kind of reference there, what, are we supposed to wait till that becomes 1 million, 2 million, 3 million? Send them F-16s, etc. Why don't we send them teachers, doctors, social workers, professionals that can rebuild the country? I'm advocating peace and a political settlement. This is a war, in my view, between NATO and Russia. Not Ukraine and Russia. NATO and Russia. In that regard, we are members of NATO in Scotland through our links with Britain. I personally want to see a defence policy that breaks that link, that repairs the damage that is unfortunately associated with Scotland historically, and I want our country's defence policy to be associated with the promotion of peace worldwide, where God knows there's plenty need for it.
The whole position, I think you have to look at it from a UK perspective and indeed from a Scottish perspective, but both apply. Who is about to invade? I just don't see invasion on the horizon. We're talking about 2.5%, GDP, 75 billion, even if we cook the figures, and yet, people can't heat their own home, and, as I was getting wrong yesterday, Thatcher sacrificed, the UK economy and high interest rates. Now we're sacrificing the UK economy and high fuel prices because businesses are going under. But, UK is now just simply a glorified American offshore aircraft carrier. That's why there's 10,000, American air, and it's almost all air personnel that are in the UK. The British Navy is smaller than the Italian Navy. It's the Italian Navy that really matters in Europe, and NATO defences are out with the United States. The French Army is bigger than the British Army. The British Army, 10 or 15% of it is Nepalese or Fijian, as I noticed when I went to Windsor Castle for a wee wander round the old England. All the soldiers were foreign. That's the absurdity, never mind the UK, Australia pact. I think, from a UK perspective, we have this delusions of grandeur post-Brexit. We have this position that we aren't the British Empire anymore, but we can be the American Empire's best friend. And they've got us in Europe, they've got Colombia in America, they've got other places in Asia, and that's what they're looking to do. So as I say, I don't see who would invade Scotland, and that's why we have to have a different position. I actually concur with Colin on NATO. I'm viewed as having played a pivotal part in positioning the SNP in support of NATO in a debate back 15 years ago. I have to say, I think at that time I could see the logic in it, which was that we were going to go into an election where the monarch was going to remain the same. And I have to say, I also take the view that we now can be openly Republican. Queen Elizabeth is gone, Charles is not exactly the same, but the currency was going to be the same, the monarchy was going to be the same, NATO was going to be the same. All that would be different would be the political powers would be here, and we could go in that direction. The world has changed with the constitutional position. I view NATO as quite frightening. A good friend of mine who was at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, a Scot and sympathetic to our cause and my own party, I remember him saying to me, be very, very careful. He was saying, back in 2013, and I said, well, tactically this is where we're going and why. Equally, it was bad then, it is a lot worse now. NATO forces are in, mentioning to Colin earlier, I've been reading an article in Asia Times Online, which is free to use. It's very actually good journalism and actually quite good. Point out there's something like 3,000 or 4,000 NATO troops in Ukraine at the moment. They are on the ground. There are British, there are Polish, there are Finnish. what happens, they're only part of their advisory capacity, and as the article pointed out, that was what they said when the Americans first went into Vietnam. They were simply military advisors. No, many of them are special forces. If they're not firing it, they're standing over people who are firing it. What happens if Russia, understandably, within international laws, actually launches a strike upon them? Because they're certainly launching strikes upon Russia. So I have to say, I think we have to be out of NATO. The push that will come from the United States to be at a minimum of 2% is just not what the Scottish economy requires. The role of NATO, whether it's been in Syria, Libya, you name it, or whatever, it is about being confrontational. So I think Scotland should seek to model itself upon Irish and the Irish Defence Forces. They have a limited defence force. They play their part internationally in Lebanon and other places, and you have to take your hat to them. They're there to protect Ireland if anybody should seek to invade them, but there doesn't seem to be anybody seeking to do that, and they're there for civil contingencies. But I think the time has come, as I say, for us to scale back in a UK perspective and in Scotland to be positioning to get out of NATO.
Thank you. So we're going to take another round of questions and comments. Education in the classroom, college cuts from Westminster, how can we deal with that? Paul's question about getting rid of the branch offices and having a Scottish Labour Party as compulsory and Scottish Tories as compulsory parties. I don't know how that would actually work, but it sounds like a great idea to me. Then we have this question about the Fifth Estate. Okay, so we've got human rights and the democratic deficit.
You said you're on strike as a college lecturer. I wanted to establish that as a socialist, I take my hat off to you. Standing up for your pay and conditions, I hope it's an example that other people are taking, and I've been completely supportive of the college lecturers being on strike in defence of their pay and conditions, particularly since further education seems to be to the poor relation in terms of the amount of money that's been spent in higher education in this country. So I wouldn't want that to go past, and I'm happy to discuss with you over a cup of tea anytime. Yeah. But without upsetting Janet. Yeah. So the point I wanted to take from all of those questions is, we don't have a majority. If you're a supporter of independence, our first and primary task is to get that majority, because all tactics flow from there. We can't put an offer to Westminster they can't refuse until we can speak for a majority of the people of Scotland in poll after poll after poll. And since we're all experienced here, we lost in 2014, albeit narrowly. That means the second referendum, whenever we have it, we have to win it, but not narrowly. Otherwise they'll say best of three. We need a significant majority, probably about 60%, so that's finally the settled will of the Scottish people. So the question for us of us who support independence is, we have to look the truth in the eye and say, if we don't have a majority just now, and I don't believe we do, then you have to ask the question, why don't we have a majority? Where's the weakness in our case? How do we make it more persuasive? How do we do better? You don't care about the result. You say we have to win the second leg. And I think there are big questions for the independence movement. And I raise them comradely, I always do. Hopefully, our case, for our economic case, is not good enough. It's not persuasive. It's too many ifs and buts, too much vagary. People want to be able to look us in the eye and go, will I be better off under an independent Scotland if I live in the schemes of Birdie House and South Houses or West Pilton or Pollock or anywhere else? And we have to put forward a more persuasive case than we've done just now. And we also have to be more confident as a movement. We've made mistakes. To err is human, to forgive divine. We're human, we made mistakes. Traipsing down to the Supreme Court in London was a madcap strategy that was not only not going to work, it was going to backfire on us. We've made mistakes, they've been genuine, but we need to be able to address when we get it wrong. We say we need to do better, we need to improve it. That's to me a challenge. I support independence and I want to win. I want to be in the winning side. So we learn from the mistakes they made in Quebec. We learn from mistakes that are made by our movement in the past. And I think one of the weaknesses is, I forget who it was, Andrew asked, the people in charge of the independence movement. There is nobody in charge of the independence movement. That's one of the troubles. We don't talk to each other, we have separate rallies, we have separate protests. The relationship in the last weeks between the Greens and the SNP, between the SNP and Alba, between the Alba and the it's not healthy, it's not good, it has to be better. And I say this, I'm entitled to, I think. I sat on the advisory board for 2 years, and it was constantly the sword of Damocles hanging over the SSP. I know what you guys are like, I know what your socialists are like. You'll split the movement, you'll break it in half, you'll walk it away, you don't respect unity, you'll break it up rather than working together and compromising. And I have to say, hand on heart, I've never heard anybody accusing the SSP of that since 2014. Not only because it's not true, it's because we gave a great deal more than we got back in return in those 2 years. And it was on the premise that there's a big prize there. There's a big prize that we can all share. And therefore sometimes if you have to swallow this or that thing that you don't like, whether it's the currency, whether it's the Republic, whether it's this or that, or working people getting a better share, we sucked it up, we sucked it up, and we sucked it up. And the Scottish Socialist Party is happy, can I say this? And the atmosphere of today and the independence movement and the independence parties that have their differences, and I'm not negating your pain, the Scottish Socialist Party is prepared to help. We'll pull together, we'll do some arbitration, conciliation. There. It's nowhere near as painful as you think. We have to get together, and we have to get more of us. As well as getting together those who do support independence, we need to get a damn sight more. That's the big challenge, isn't it? You all know it's the case, we know it's the case. We've got 45%, we need 60%. And I'm not in favour of having that second referendum. Here's my cake and eating it. I'm not in favour of having that second referendum until we can prove we've got that 60%. And then we take it to London and go, come ahead, I dare you. I dare you to say we can't have a second referendum. There's 60% of the people in Scotland wanting it. They wouldn't dare. They just wouldn't dare. They would know how to retreat because they are clever, and don't ever underestimate your enemy.
Thank you very much, Colin. And the bit I forgot to say in the roundup, I knew I'd forgotten something, but very important point, which is Andy's point about the media. And how do we do it without the media? So
I'm going to carry on nonetheless from what Colin was talking about there, which and kind of pick up on a couple of points, because actually what I think is really important, and this ties into Andrew's question there about how do we become independent, and obviously the issues around the media and things like that, which I'll get to. The Labour Party are about to win an overwhelming majority in the Westminster Parliament off the back of, in Scotland, a lot of independent supporters voting for the Labour Party. They're going to, I mean, hopefully we minimise those gains that they make here across the Central Belt in Scotland, but there's, I don't think, much question that they're going to make some gains. And that will be off the back of voters that we know here that support independence and have voted for the SNP or other independence parties in the past. And so the question is for the Scottish Labour Party, I think, moving forward. The Labour Party moving forward. It's established as not the Scottish Labour Party. What are they going to do about that? How do they reconcile that? How do they, with the power that I discussed earlier that they have so much of over the first and then potentially second term of a Westminster Labour government, reconcile the fact that they are now have a significant portion of their voter base in Scotland which is supportive of Scottish independence. And so that is a question that ties in, I suppose, to that question about how we become independent, because I think we're going to see, and it's something that Colin was talking about earlier, about how the Labour Party, we know that they're going to fail. Because I don't think they have an answer to that question. And when independence vote supporters see that the answer to the question about our constitutional question about Scottish independence doesn't ever and will never lie with the Labour Party, that puts more onus on us as an independence movement to say, right, well, how do we come together, how do we work together to make sure that we use our electoral mandates to drive the independence agenda, because we know for a fact that the Labour Party are never going to be the answer for independence and for independence supporters in Scotland. You touched on energy policy as well. I think that, Andrew, I completely agree, 100%. the energy policy, I think that's one of the main messages that Scottish politicians should be going down to London or should be campaigning on, is the failure of energy policy across the UK. We've become so dependent on natural gas flows, and the fact that is at the mercy of the international market, which has spiked because of war in Ukraine, etc., has meant that people in the UK are paying the highest electricity prices in the world. Because the Westminster has failed to invest in gas storage, where 40% of our electricity comes from natural gas. The cost of living crisis is the biggest issue for people. I think that we probably could do better to take that point down to.
I'm not saying it's
I agree, but there's lots of failures around energy policy, and I think that the messaging that's coming out of certainly my own party has started to increase around, for example, the standing charges that you mentioned as well, around how unfair the standing charges are in Scotland, where we pay more here, even though we're so close to the source of electricity and energy that's being produced in the middle of London, purely because they're trying to build an energy policy which tries to encourage these dense urban populations instead of rewarding investment in, for example, our renewable energy, which we know in Scotland 90% of our energy comes from renewables, whereas in London in the UK, in England more broadly, they're falling behind on that purely just because they have a dislike of renewable energy. They've made onshore wind farms legal since 2017. It's disgusting when communities across Scotland and the UK are paying, the highest electricity in the world. People are struggling to make ends meet. Energy policy is a big topic that touches on the independence question, because with an independent Scotland we could do so much better with our energy policy with the natural abundant resources that we have here. Peter, we've spoken about this lots of times. All solidarity, obviously, to you and the rest of the college lecturers that are still striking. It's good to hear that you're out in front of your house the other day.
I think corruption is a key word, because I think we have to take a long, hard look, and this is part of the problem I have with the parties at the moment. We have to take a long, hard look at who is financially backing the political parties in this country.
Correct.
Yeah, and I don't mean any disrespect, please don't take it the wrong way, but I think with even the SNP, some of the senior leadership, I'd be curious to learn about some of the links that they have with, but I'll leave it there, so it's a point for discussion.
The links they have with what?
Well, okay. There's been MSPs that have come out and said that they were compromised by MI5, British intelligence.
Correct.
There's various people who arguably are not helping the movement from the SNP's own perspective. So that's, I'm just opening that as a point for discussion. I'm not making any definitive claims.
There's been an infiltration in every single working class movement since the beginning of time.
Correct.
Infiltration in your movement, there'll be infiltration in Kenny's movement, infiltration in the Labour Party is absolutely as evident as anything. Infiltration in working class movements is
Correct.
not a new thing.
It's not party. It's not something that happens to one particular political party.
Absolutely.
And certainly as a peace activist, it's something that we're very aware of happens all the time.
Can I just respond there quickly, because the British establishment does have a specific interest in a party that wants to break up the union. That is a very specific national security interest. So I think maybe the SNP is in a different category there, but
well, I think that's a whole other discussion. But it's good to raise it. Kenny, do you have some?
I think basically talking about independence, and that's been the problem. The problem is people now view it as something that would be quite nice, like a hot summer, like a summer holiday, but they just don't believe it's going to happen because the tap has been turned off, the direction is the strategy that's being pursued. I fully agree with Colin. The appeal to the Supreme Court was idiocy, unbridled. The clue is actually in the name United Kingdom Supreme Court. The idea they were ever going to win there was just fanciful and actually put us in a worse position. And equally, you know, IndyRef 2, it's become a mantra. It reminds me actually of what the Labour Party used to be like many years ago, you know, when they talked about Clause 4, and they talked about, and they sang the red flag. That's what it is now actually for a lot of the, you know, senior SNP, if I put it that way. You know, IndyRef 2, nobody believes it's coming. Nobody believes it's coming. You know, it's been closed off. What we have to do is to have a strategy and we have to have action. There is no strategy. This idea that we're going to huff and puff, we're going to lose more seats, and then we're going to ask, with a renewed mandate, ask, you know, the incoming Labour government to give us a second independence referendum. Starmer's already said, you ain't getting it, Jock, get back in your box. So, I mean, that is just absurd. What we have to do is to start building up. You have to have a strategy, you have to have action. You know, sovereignty does rest with the Scottish people, but political power rests with the establishment, and that's why you have to get round it. And that's why you have to, you know, the campaigning has to start again. The strength of running into 2014, because it deals with the media in Scotland is dying. People are no longer even watching the BBC News or whatever. It is also dangerous for democracy because things are now going, you know, online. But the strength of the movement and what nearly got us over the line in 2014 was out on the doorsteps. And yet we've been told to stop marching, we've been told not to do this, we've been told not to do that. What we have to do is to recognise we do have to get back out there and speak and engage, because it's not going to come through the newspapers or the TV screens. We do have to have a strategy, which is not simply to say we're going to beg for another Section 30. We do have to start ramping up the action. When you go down to Westminster, you shouldn't be going down. I never thought I would see the day when the SNP start having shadow spokespersons for Northern Ireland, and indeed a shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. We don't want to be the administration. How can you have a shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer when you don't want to be the British government? You know, so we've got to be more disruptive politically. Legal options are very, very limited, because you're right, it's a human right, but so's not to get killed in Gaza, and there's not much happening there in international courts. So you do have to make legal points. Professor McCorkindale has given some clues about where we go, but we're going to ramp up the action politically. We're going to get people back motivated, and it comes back to motivating our people. I think, you know, it's not just about independence. That's a good idea. What you've got to do is to relate it to people. We don't have to be living like this. We are energy rich, and yet we're fuel poor. Nothing makes a case for independence more than that. You know, even point to Norway or things like that. The fact is, you can't pay your electricity bill, and yet the wind turbines are onshore, offshore, and that's before we even start hitting, you know, wave and other tidal matters that are going to come here. Scotland is blessed for the first time in its history because of its, you know, environment and its location. Equally, some of the blame has to go, especially for Aberdeen. We have the ScotWind auction. You hear that? Which, you know, Nicola Sturgeon bragged about getting £800 million. Very good. 1 month after she bragged about getting £800 million for all of that was handed over, the state of New York, you know, hardly a socialist community, the state of New York licensed 25%, a quarter of what we licensed in Scotland, and got $4.3 billion. And you can't say the American energy market's bigger, because we're part of the European market. Because the stuff we produce can go to England, can go to Holland, it can go to Norway, we can sell it to Germany, because there's cables that go into Norway and just go down through Scandinavia. So we sold ourselves short, or were sold out and sold at a pittance, and that's why, as I say, we've got to make that point and start driving it home. You know, I'll finally conclude on one of the wind farms to come in the River Forth makes a case near Nagaith. It's a Gaelic name. It's actually an Irish Gaelic name. Why? Because who owns it? EDF, the State Energy Operator of France, and ESB, the Electricity Board of the Republic of Ireland. It is the Irish Republic's, or the Electricity Board's, single biggest investment out with the island of Ireland. Where are the turbines coming from? Teesside or down south. They're going to get assembled by a mechanical kit at Dundee. So you lose high-skilled jobs, you lose high-skilled contract. Who's doing the cabling? Fred Olsen from Norway. Where's the cables coming from? Belgium. Some other stuff's coming from Italy. Some of my constituents worked offshore on the tankers and ships. They decided this would be a good idea because they're servicing the boats out of Montrose. It would be a good idea to get a job on that. You'd be home easier and you wouldn't have to fly in. They got laid off and replaced by South Asian labour, because once you're operating out with UK territorial waters, 12 miles, and many of these offshore wind farms, they're more than 12 miles, laid off and replaced by guys on £3.30. No jobs. So as I say, we've got to bang that hole. We've got to, make the case we should be able to provide our folk with energy, if not at cost price, certainly for very little. We should be encouraging businesses to locate here. We should be making sure we get the manufacturing, making turbines at Armage, making turbines at Bifab. Every estuary in Scotland should be hammering, banging and riveting, because there's so much work to be done. All of that, I was actually speaking to one of the guys from SSE, well, you've missed out on the turbines, he said. But to be fair to him, he said, there's the cables. And I actually see the cables, and you need something like 8 to hold one of these floating offshore winds, 8 down. Every wee ringlet is the size of an adult. There's about 6 to 8 feet. You've got to be manufactured. We should be getting the jobs, and as it is, we're going to become a transmission station. So that's why we've got to make the case. Energy rich, fuel poor, unless we get control of that, we're not going to be able to turn things round.
Thank you very much, Kenny. I think we've gone a long way towards airing some of the questions that we need to work on and answer, and I think both Colin and Kenny have very directly challenged everybody in this room to make sure that they're going to be active in the development of a strong and united campaign for independence. I'd like to ask you to thank our illustrious panel.